I see the King of Glory coming on the clouds with fire. The whole earth shakes. The whole earth shakes.
So my last few videos have more or less been responses to non-believers in the comments section. And those have more or less generated a lot of interest and interaction. And some of the comments have actually been decent. They're not all trolls. So I've decided to continue to respond to them. Hopefully this will be something my audience continues to find interesting. It's not too far off my normal beat anyway. Certainly made religious videos before, politics as well, and this is sort of a combination of the two. And the comments have given me the opportunity to tell the story of how I see the world unfolding. Both my explanation for some of the terrors that we witnessed in the last century, as well as my prescription to hopefully have a better century this time around. Of course, the viewer can take it for what they will, and at the very least, it should be interesting. So in this video, I'm going to be replying to a user called Phototum. I think I'm saying that correctly, hopefully. We're going to talk about, looks like, war. We're going to talk about some communism, wealth in developed countries, and we're going to get into this again, biblical values versus mere professions of Christendom. It seems I wasn't clear enough the first two times I tried to explain the dichotomy between hearers only and doers. So this person clearly comes from an atheist perspective, and they also come from, seems to be political left-leaning person, and it just bleeds into their comments. So I suspect it's sort of his blind spot. So my guess is if this person lived in the US, they would be a Democrat, but that might be called something else in a different English-speaking country. So let's get into it. Look at the outcome of World War II. We quite literally learned from our mistakes. There's NATO and the UN, coalitions of most states in the world that pledge to peacefully coexist, effectively stopping the time of colonialism and fights over territory with your neighbors. Have we now? Again, I don't know what history you're looking at. No, clearly, like, if you were just looking from the perspective of, say, a citizen in Great Britain, you could say, yeah, like, no foreign power has bombed London since, World War II. So I guess in certain parts of the world, it's been pretty peaceful. Because no foreign powers bombed the United States since World War II, unless you count 9/11, I suppose. But that wasn't. It's more of a terrorist organization, I guess, than an official foreign power. Probably doesn't matter too much to the people that were in the towers at the time. But that said, like, there's plenty of places on Earth that have seen plenty of conflict. I guess technically the second Iraq War started in the 21st century, but that still left, thousands of American soldiers dead and tens of thousands with severe injuries, all of them with some sort of emotional trauma that they carry with them for the rest of their lives. And that's just on the American side of the casualty ledger. There was easily hundreds of thousands of casualties of Iraqi people as a result of that war. And that's just one example. My understanding is that NATO was basically built to be a counterweight against the Soviet Union. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union, while they were technically on our side during the conflict, as soon as the conflict was over, we did have a common enemy to work together against, and the Soviets had at that time amassed a huge army, and they were sitting on half of Europe. As the Eastern Front had collapsed, they'd come to occupy Poland and East Germany, and I believe parts of the Baltic states. There was a real fear that they could easily decide, hey, well, while we're at it, why don't we just keep going and take over the rest of Germany and maybe France, and we'll be the Soviet states of all of Europe. So NATO was sort of created to keep Western Europe free from Soviet influence. And while, especially after both sides had developed nuclear weapons, a direct war between America and the Soviets, or NATO and the Soviets, would have been too costly. That doesn't mean that innumerable proxy wars were fought with, in some cases, direct participation of one of the parties, or backing of conflicts in different areas. So I don't know, you talk about this peaceful coexistence. Clearly, we have a different read on history. I wouldn't count North Korea, Vietnam, all the proxy wars and conflicts in the Middle East, in even the Central Americas. What was the Cuban Missile Crisis all about? What was all the turmoil in, say, Venezuela all about? And you could say, well, this was stopping the time of colonialism. Okay, well, if your intelligence services in your country decide, hey, this government in this other country over here really isn't as pro-Western or pro-Soviet as we would like, so let's work to overthrow that government and install this other government that's sort of a puppet, or maybe puppet's a little bit strong. Maybe they're just a lot more pro-Western or pro-communist. And this results in, let's say, a civil war or just decades of instability and violence. I don't know if you technically call that colonialism, but it's still, foreign powers meddling in the affairs of smaller, less developed countries. So what does this have to do with the existence of God? Kind of seems like I'm on a tangent here, but he attributes this to secular democratic governments. Well, hopefully I can tie this all together. Let's look at paragraph 2. So I wonder, though, what are these terrible beliefs that spring up, which is something I mentioned in my previous video, I believe. I hope you don't mean communism, since that is a form of government, not a belief. And most countries abandon it, so why argue about it? Oh, I don't know, why should we be interested in communism? Because it was an predominant ideology in the last century, and it was a terrible system that resulted in tens of millions, probably over 100 million deaths of innocent people at the hands of their government. If you count the Soviets and the CCP, the various other communist regimes, I'm sure their civilian death toll, just innocent people that either starved to death or murdered by their government, is well within the 100 million range. So, for no other reason, we should make sure we really understand what happened and where it came from. And B, it explains a lot of this conflict we were just talking about. It was NATO trying to stem the advance of communism that, the two camps competing with one another is probably what led to most of the conflicts in the second half of the 20th century. Okay, so read this paragraph that you wrote again, and then think about it for 2 minutes and see if you still stand by that statement. Because to me, this is utter nonsense. Reading from you, I hope you don't mean communism, since that is a form of government, not a belief, and most countries abandon it, so why argue about it? Since that is a form of government, not a belief, what do you think governments are? How do you think they come to exist? Do you think Vladimir Lenin just, had decided to have a revolution one day, and then they prevailed, and they were like, okay, now that we're in charge, what kind of government should we set up, guys? And you think Stalin was around and he said, I don't know, let's roll the government dice. Look, it landed on communism. What the hell is that? Oh, I don't know, but we better look into it, because I guess we're setting up a communist government. It's not how it works, bro. People come to believe in ideologies, right? And then they go around and try to convince other people of these ideologies. And if a critical mass of people start to believe in this ideology, they can often prevail against the existing ideology and replace it. It's called a revolution. Now, there's different types of people that get involved in revolutions. Some people maybe aren't that ideological. They're more opportunist, and they say, look, this movement's really taking off. I should jump on that bandwagon so that on the other end of it, I'll be in a better spot. So there are people like that maybe they aren't true believers, but in any movement, there obviously are a lot of true believers. So to say this is not a belief, there was a lot of people that believed communism was a good idea and that it should be implemented around the world. And they pursued it with much the same fervor and zeal as some people pursue their religious beliefs. So you set up this very compartmentalized definition of belief that beliefs only have to do with God. No, people believe in all kinds of things and they act on them. When Christopher Columbus set sail, for example, he believed that he was going to reach India. By that time, most people knew that the world was round. That really wasn't in debate in enlightened circles, but Christopher Columbus believed the world was a lot smaller than it was. So he thought he would reach India without much trouble. And not only was he wrong about the size of the earth, but he also didn't know that there was this other big continent in between Spain and India called North America, and he just sort of ran into it by accident. But still, he was acting on the belief that if he just left Spain and sailed in this direction, eventually he would hit India. Atheists like to cringe at terms like belief and faith, and they have a very juvenile understanding of those terms. But we all believe in things, and we act on those beliefs. Governments are no different. In fact, they're blaring examples of this. Let's look to the U.S. What beliefs did America's founding fathers believe in? Well, you don't have to guess. You can read what they wrote. What does it say in the Declaration of Independence? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights like life, liberty, and happiness. Now, why did Jefferson pen the Declaration of Independence the way that he did? Because Jefferson and many of his contemporaries were they believed in natural rights. Jefferson was a student of political philosopher John Locke. In fact, he admired the man so much that he had a portrait of John Locke in his home. I know, I visited Jefferson's home once. And among portraits of other men that he admired was John Locke, the 17th century political philosopher, often considered the father of classical liberalism, and talked a lot about natural rights. And if you read the Declaration of Independence, what case were they making? People have natural rights, whether governments recognize them or not, and the whole purpose of government. So the purpose of a legitimate government is to uphold the rights of the people. And if a government begins to perform contrary to that mandate, let's say they start to trample the rights of the people, well, then that government becomes illegitimate, and it is the right and the duty of people to overthrow that government. And that was their justification for breaking away from Great Britain and setting up their own thing. So the United States very much was a government built by people that were very skeptical of government control. They observed all the forms of tyranny that had existed in Europe throughout the ages. And they said, we can do better. Let's set up a system with a ton of checks and balances. We'll divide power up so many different ways so that no one group can get too much power. We'll put in a Bill of Rights that explicitly protects the rights of individual people. And hopefully all these safeguards will keep the thing stable. Well, they did so because they were acting on their beliefs. They truly believed in things like natural rights, and they truly believed that governments tended towards corruption, so that's why they wrote in all these safeguards. And they had an ideology. They had, John Locke and his contemporaries, people who wrestled with classical liberalism and argued for its cause. And who influenced John Locke? Well, he was influenced by various Christians. Now, contrast America's founding and sort of the evolution of their ideology with that of communists. Lenin, for example, leaned heavily on Marxism. In fact, his particular brand of Marxism was called Marxist-Leninism. Where did Marxist beliefs come from? Well, they came from Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was very much an anti-theist. He described religion as the opiate of the masses. See, Karl Marx had his own ideas that he believed in, and he went around convincing other people to believe in them. And among these beliefs was a very cartoonish worldview of how he broke down society into class. There was the working people, the proletariat, and then there was the bourgeois and bourgeoisie, the capitalist people that controlled everything. There was these clear distinctions, and that basically these classes were at war with one another. Very much this us versus them. Very much the poor people. They're poor through no fault of their own ever. It's just they're oppressed by these rich people. And if the poor people just rise up, kill all the rich people, take their stuff and redistribute it, it'll usher in something of a worker's paradise. Now, I call that worldview cartoonish because it's not really how the world works. Now, there's bits and pieces of something resembling truth in that worldview, but it's exaggerated and simplified to the point of being absurd. Not only that, but it's in direct opposition to the Word of God. If Marxism isn't a lie straight out of the pit of hell, well, then certainly the way disciples of Marx, the Lenins and the Maos of the world, certainly the way they took those teachings and implemented them, certainly those were definitionally demonic. And they weren't just demonic because communists tended to be very secular. Marx himself was very anti-religion, thought it was just a scam to control people. So I guess his solution was to come up with a different scam to control people and call it communism. And certainly Lenin and Stalin, Stalin was raised with some religious tradition, but rejected it at a very young age and became very anti-religious. That's not what makes it demonic. It's also in conflict with all sorts of biblical principles. The whole class tension that they stoke, it's all based on envy. It's just, let's look around and find people that are wealthier than us, and let's just hate on those people because they have more stuff than us. Remember that commandment, thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's? If your neighbor's doing better than you, maybe you should look into his lifestyle and say, hey, is that guy doing something that I'm not? Can I learn from his example? That would be the healthy way to deal with envy. The communist way was, my neighbor, I'm going to shoot that bastard and expropriate his means of production. And that's another biblical principle that it violates. Expropriating the means of production is just fancy words for getting in power and stealing other people's stuff and then redistributing it the way that you see fit, which usually meant using it to reward party loyalists. If you were a good communist and high standing with the party, you generally lived very high on the hog. I think they made a movie about it. It was called Animal Farm, based on Orwell's book. Remember the pigs? Yeah, the pigs were a representation of the ruling party, the communist. So let's see, we've already broke the commandment about not coveting. We've broken the commandment about not stealing. Oh, and here's the other thing. When you start taking people's stuff, when you start expropriating things that people spent their lifetimes building, maybe their families spent lifetimes building, maybe a farm or some business, when you decide you're going to just take that from people, a lot of times people resist. So what else did the communists do? Well, they killed those people. They just liquidated them and took their stuff anyway. So let's see, how many commandments have we broken so far? 4 or 5? By the way, the Bible speaks to this tension between rich and poor. And it says you shouldn't show partiality to the rich nor the poor. Nobody should be treated any different before the law. And to be fair, there is a glimmer of truth in some of the Marxist complaints against the ruling class. There are rich people that use their wealth and their power to oppress poor people. But there's also people that are wealthy through peaceful means, that earn their wealth the hard way, the legitimate way. They build businesses and serve their customers, and they do well in an environment where voluntary exchange can take place because they're really, really good at serving their customers. So yeah, there are some bad actors that happen to be rich, but there's also a lot of good people that happen to be rich. So you can't just paint them with a broad brush. You have to judge individuals on their own merit, not just throw them into a class and decide that class is bad. And the same is true of the poor. A lot of times people look down on the poor and say, well, they're that way because they're lazy, or they made poor choices and they didn't learn from them, and they keep making those poor choices and they stay poor. And in some cases, that's true. There are poor people who are poor because they just make the same dumb choices over and over again. Maybe they're alcoholics or drug addicts, and that takes over their life, and they can never get ahead. And addiction is a thing that a lot of people struggle with, but in any event, like just throwing other people's money at an addict doesn't really help that addict. It just means they've got more money to go out and party with, and then they're broke again. So it's a more complex problem than just redistributing the wealth. But it's also true that a lot of people are poor through no fault of their own. Maybe they just got dealt a really difficult hand in life. Maybe they have some sort of physical or mental disability that keeps them from being able to earn a lot. Or they just have terrible circumstances that befall them and prevent them from ever being able to become wealthy. But the Marxists didn't really want to sort all that out. That was a little too complicated. They like broad strokes. It's us, the working class, versus those people over there. So let's get our pitchforks and our rifles and go dispatch those people. And then when we win, we'll redistribute all their stuff. At its core, communism was a gang of godless, murderous thieves who went out and convinced enough of the people to go along with their cause. And what sort of people would go along with that cause? I mean, Russia was no stranger to the church. I mean, they had the Eastern Orthodox tradition, I believe, is fairly prominent there. But clearly, a critical mass of the population drifted away from God and did not retain God in their hearts, or else they would have never gone along with this. I mean, the New Testament teaches, love thy neighbor as thyself. It doesn't teach, hey, go murder your neighbor because he's got a little bit more than you, and then take his stuff. The Bible teaches to not envy other men. It doesn't teach to covet them to the point of wanting to steal from them. The Bible teaches to not show partiality to the rich nor the poor. While we're looking at communism, let's look at fascism. People tend to think of communism and fascism as opposite ends of the political spectrum, but that's not really how it works. If the communist was at its core was just a murderous gang of rabble-rousers that wanted to take over their country and have their way with it, the fascists were basically the same thing. They just had a different PR firm. They just had a different, a slightly different message. See, the Nazis were actually National Socialists as opposed to Marxist, Leninist socialist. And they were in competition for the hearts and minds of the people. So there was a lot of tension between them, not because they were polar opposites. They were actually very much alike. They were just competing for a lot of the same territory. An apt comparison would be like organized crime. If the Gambinos and the Bananos are fighting over a specific territory in the city, they're not fighting with each other because they're the opposite of each other. They're fighting with each other because they're basically mirror images of each other, and they're in competition for basically the same thing. Now, the communists leaned into class conflict, as where the Nazis leaned into more ethnic and racial tension. I mean, they wanted to take people's stuff too. I mean, they were a bunch of thieves, but instead of just stealing from the rich generically, they came up with certain groups that they targeted. Like, hey, these Jews seem to have a lot of money and wealth. Maybe we should turn all the people against them, and then we'll expropriate their stuff for our purposes. People are naturally suspicious of the others, and fascists just leaned into that, similar to the way the Marxists leaned into class envy. And the reason such a terrible ideology gained traction in the 20s and 30s in Germany was because the people, again, had drifted away. Their hearts and minds of the people had drifted away from solid biblical principles. So had they been reading the New Testament and diligently hearkening onto its teachings, they would know that God made all the nations of one blood. We're all brethren. In fact, in the New Testament, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, but we're all one in Christ. Now, the New Testament does divide people into believers and non-believers, and then it probably subdivides the believers into, true believers, people that are diligently following the teachings of Christ, and then sort of the apostates, the people that pretend. But its prescription isn't to deal harshly with the others. It's in fact to love thine enemy, to convert them through a good example. It's one of the reasons that I'm nice to a lot of you atheists. Some of you are decent. Like this guy I'm responding to, he's giving me arguments. And some of them aren't very good arguments, but at least he's not insulting me or trying to abuse me. Some of the other people are just look at your comments. But am I returning evil for evil? No, I'm just politely responding to criticism of my beliefs. So while the Christian worldview, yes, it does divide people into believers and unbelievers, the solution to the unbelievers is to love them and try to convert them with kindness. Nowhere in my New Testament teachings does it tell me to start stealing the non-believers' stuff and kill them or put them into camps if they resist. So that's what I mean when I talk about there was a falling away from true Christian faith in Germany, Russia, other places in Europe, and that's when fascism and communism crept in. Because men's hearts weren't with God. They were far away from God. And because of that, these various demonic ideologies could creep in and take hold and reach a critical mass where they boiled over, and you had communist revolutions and you had fascist revolutions. Your list of principles makes no sense to me. You seem to imply that there are specific biblical values that people of other or no other religions don't hold, or they are rather irrelevant. I don't think I ever say that no other religions hold some of the principles that you could find in the New Testament. I mean, most religions have some sort of prohibition on murder, for example, or stealing. I wouldn't say that. I would just say the New Testament is a lot more complete and coherent in its principles. And I'm saying that as somebody who's studied it. Not only read it cover to cover, but I've actually studied it quite a bit. He goes on to say, people generally prefer to have a stable life before committing to children, although marriage isn't needed for that. Again, he's responding to my comment in my last video, where I suggest that it's a biblical principle to wait till marriage, and I even add, or at the very least, being in a stable relationship. So I'm not sure if he's a U.S. person or a European. He seems to have a favorable opinion of how they do things in Europe. So in Europe, you can raise a child as a single parent, though, without having to hold 3 jobs and never take any vacation. just to make it through the month. Well, do you really think that's the case in the U.S.? I don't live in Europe, so I'm not an expert on all the things that go on in Europe and how each country does its welfare programs. We actually do have a lot of welfare programs in the U.S. So single parents, provided they're not making a ton of money, actually qualify for all sorts of assistance programs. We have Medicaid, which is basically like heavily subsidized health insurance for low-income people. So if you're poor enough, you can get your medical care for more or less free. And that would include your children, your dependents. We have rent assistance programs. We have food assistance programs. I don't know any single mothers that work 3 jobs. Although I have known some that don't work any jobs and still somehow get by. But there's more to a two-parent, a stable two-parent household than just more monetary resources. How about a stable father figure that, especially for young men, but young women need father figures too, to help give them a good example. So there's more to the problem than merely material resources. And even though we do have these welfare programs, that's not adequate. I mean, just throwing other people's money at said people's poor life choices, having kids that they're in no position to raise. Just throwing other people's money at those families, it might solve some problems, but it's inadequate to often successfully raise a well-adjusted child. But anyway, here's a point that I want to make again for the 3rd time. So he writes to me, to your, in a wealthy, developed country, who prospers more argument. So it's basically making the argument that people that follow biblical principles in their life tend to have better lives, better life outcomes. I found statistics in Pew Research about income distribution, unsure from when, which clearly suggests that religiosity inversely correlates with their income. The more people believe and are certain in, the more likely they are in low income brackets. But overall, it doesn't seem to have much of a deciding factor, but more the environment they grew up in general. Now, in the second part of his post, he did this in 2 parts. He also says, you don't need to believe in any deities to not be a criminal. Again, look at Europe and not your own country. We have largely, okay, so I guess he is European. We have largely secular societies, and the crime rate aren't even in the same ballpark as yours. But if you look at prisons in the U.S., you'll find a lot of religious people. There are relatively few non-religious. Religiosity obviously isn't a hindrance to commit crime, equally as non-religiosity isn't a motivator or excuse to do crime. So if you look back on how I stated this in earlier posts, I'm very careful as to how I choose my words. See, I say I would contend that it is a falling away from not just a belief in God, but also godly principles that brings about the hard times. So either I'm being too subtle or people are just not understanding what I'm saying. I'll see if I can be more blunt. There's a difference between hearers of the word and doers of the word. Okay, there's a difference between merely professing a faith and actually practicing a faith. And see, one point of confusion is that men often judge by outward appearances only, as where God's judgment is deeper. God judges the heart. So it's easy for a man to say he is this or that or whatever. It's certainly easy for a man to declare a belief, God or any other deity. But for that matter, it's easy for a man to declare his atheism and brag about how rational and enlightened, smarter he is than his theist-believing brethren, because, look, he's an atheist. Although, examine that man and try to have a conversation with him, his opinion of himself isn't always borne out. The same is true of men that claim to be Christian. Let me try to come up with an analogy to sort of underscore my point. There's different classes of men as far as how they treat women. Let's say there's a man who's a really shitty husband. Let's say maybe he's abusive in physical ways or other ways. Maybe he's also a cheat. Isn't faithful to his wife. Perhaps he's just sort of a deadbeat in the relationship. Just doesn't pull his weight. Doesn't do a great job providing for his family. And, maybe he sits in the house and watches TV or plays video games while his wife is out shoveling the snow or tending to the various upkeeps of the house. But let's say he's got a real slick tongue and he's really good at sweet-talking his wife. Maybe his wife doesn't have the highest self-esteem. She's just desperate for that kind of praise, so she just eats it up. Because of this, she puts up with all his nonsense. So he's a terrible husband in every other way, but he really knows how to manipulate this woman verbally. Now let's say there's a second man who's also a husband. And he, for whatever reason, has difficulty expressing his emotions verbally. Maybe he's just, for some reason, he's repressed in that way. Can't quite find the words, but in every other way, he's a great husband. Holds a good job, provides for the family when he's home. He's taking care of the lawn, taking out the trash. He's involved with the kids, tries to be a good father. Constantly working on things around the house to try to upkeep the place. Now, which man loves his wife more? I think a lot of people wouldn't argue the point. Clearly, the second guy seems to have a lot more love and respect for his wife. But if all you did is talk to them, you wouldn't be able to tell this. If you just talk to the pollster from Pew Research, and he was to just call these two guys up, I'm sure the first guy would give him this great big earful about how much he loves his wife and how he's such a great husband. And the second guy you would call and he would be like, yeah, I guess I love my wife. But he's not the best at verbal communication, so it probably wouldn't be as apparent through a conversation with him on the phone. So that's what I'm trying to tell you, is the data you're referencing, and kudos to actually referencing data. At least you're trying to have a data-driven argument, which is light years ahead of the people that just want to, make fun of me for believing in my sky daddy. But what I'm going to tell you is the data doesn't necessarily suggest what you think it suggests. So going back to my analogy of the crappy husband, God is not your wife. You're not going to bullshit God. The 4th chapter of Book of Hebrews, it says, "For the word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account." So to reiterate, men can say all sorts of things. They can profess all sorts of things. God decides whether or not he believes them. Look into the book of Isaiah. "Because this people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me." The book of Ezekiel. "And they come to you as people come, and they sit before you as my people. And they hear what you say, but they will not do it. For with lustful talk in their mouths they act, their heart is set on their gain." In the book of Matthew, when Jesus was walking the earth and ministering, he quotes the book of Isaiah. "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Again, they honor God with their lips, but they don't really follow him. Instead, they follow their own doctrines, not the ones that come from God. So, my friend, I'm not concerned about religiosity per se. I'm concerned as to whether or not men are truly following the commandments of God, or are they just playing religion? Perhaps some of them are even earnest, but they're not truly following God's doctrines. They're following doctrines of men. Now, you might be tempted to say, "Well, Fletch, that sounds like you're making a no true Scotsman defense." I assure you that's not what I'm doing. Actually, what I'm talking about is explicitly expressed in the scriptures on numerous occasions. So let's look to the Sermon on the Mount, which is arguably the most well-known teachings of Christ. These are teachings directly attributed to Christ. They're found in both the book of Matthew as well as the book of Luke. It's where we get the Beatitudes. It's where we get, love thine enemy. It's where we get, judge not, lest you be judged. With what measure you judge, you shall also be judged. That all comes from the Sermon on the Mount, as do these verses. So it says, this is Matthew 7, starting with verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonderful works in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Now, this verse ought to terrify you, if you're a Christian. And when I was a younger Christian, I found this verse very troubling. I mean, I could be doing everything I thought I was supposed to be doing and still be rejected of God. But the moral of the story is, it's not profession of a faith alone that gets you into heaven. Because it's easy to say things, but God judges the heart. You actually have to believe it. And true faith is manifest in your deeds. If you truly believe something, it will show up in how you live your life. And if we look to the previous verses, we find this expressed. So, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you shall know them. So let's say there's a random tree growing in my backyard, and it doesn't have a sign on it saying what kind of tree it is. How do I know what kind of tree it is? Well, I can wait till it gets into its season when it starts to produce fruit. And if walnuts happen to grow on the tree, well, then I know it's a walnut tree. If apples grow on the tree, well, then I know it's an apple tree, and so forth. And let's say somebody comes along and puts a sign on the tree before it's in its season. And the sign says that this is a pear tree. And someone comes along and starts mocking me and saying, clearly this is a pear tree. Look at the sign. It says pear tree on it. I say, yeah, I know what the sign says, buddy, but I'm not sure I believe that sign. Because a man can write anything on a sign, come back in a few months, and see what kind of fruit is growing on it, and then I'll decide what kind of tree it is. Okay, so do you dig now? Like, I'm making myself clear. Like, what people say they are isn't always what they actually are. So what does that mean for our conversation? It means all your data doesn't necessarily say what you think it says. Polling people to find out what their religiosity level is, and then comparing that to some life outcomes and looking for correlations. Well, I'll give props to you. At least you're trying to be data-driven. I'm just saying, the data doesn't necessarily tell the story that you think it does. There's a whole lot of variables. Like, first of all, how are you measuring religiosity? Is it merely a phone survey? On a scale of 1 to 10, how religious would you say you are? And then how are you pairing that up with life outcomes? Oh, this guy, he really, really believes in God, but look, his life is shit. Well, how do you know he really believes in God? Well, he said so on my phone survey. So what I'm saying is, you can tell any story you want to, depending on how you want to look at the data. But your data on the subject is suspect. So this user, he wrote me a lengthy comment, which I appreciate, but a lot of this is his personal political gripes, and I'm not going to bother responding to all of it for two reasons. One, this video is already way longer than I wanted it to be, and two, I've already spoken to these topics, a lot of the issues that he raises in other videos, so I'm not going to rehash it all here in detail. What I would do instead is just direct people to my other content. I made a video on, for example, why the Democrats lost the 2024 election. Made a video, like, basically just showcasing how people lied about Trump. And it's not that there isn't legitimate criticism of the man. It's just that, the other side just grossly exaggerates everything. I've got one on RFK Jr. and his critiques of the Democratic Party in America. And keep in mind, he used to be a Democrat. In fact, Trump used to be a Democrat at one point. RFK used to be a Democrat. You might ask yourself, if Trump and conservatives and Republicans are so bad, how come so many Democrats are now switching over to their side? I digress. I didn't want to bring all that up in this video because it's already long enough. But if you're interested, I already have plenty of videos on this topic, and I'm not going to make this video 3 hours long. So hopefully people have found this interesting. If you disagree with me, that's fine. My only request would be civil in the comment section. If you're going to disagree with me, give me your best argument for why I'm wrong. Don't just slew insults at me.